So good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the first of our trilogy of the IWM lectures. Many of you who are familiar with both the institution of the IWM lecture and of the institute itself know very well that this is a series in which we invite guests to come and deliver 3 lectures, which are then published in English, in German, and in Polish as monographs. The last one, which you may have seen, are Jan van der Mulle's lectures on populism, which were delivered here also as IWM lectures. It's a great, great pleasure to welcome Professor Stephen Kotkin, who's had a harrowing journey to us, unfortunately, but he's here. That's the most important. He is the John P. Birkeland 52 Professor in History and International Affairs at the Woodrow Wilson School and also a professor at the History Department at Princeton University. And he's also fellow of the Hoover Institute at Stanford. Most of you would know his work both on modern authoritarianism and especially his biography of Stalin, which is, I think, one of the most stunning biographies I have ever read. For one, because Stalin appears so late in the book, and what it really deals with, rather than just a biography of Stalin, is about the paradoxes of power. Power, authoritarian power, more generally, and also, in a sense, it is an entire history of the making of the Soviet state. One of the things I remember most vividly is your characterization of 1918 as the year of Lenin and Dada. And so the book has these kinds of juxtapositions, unexpected, totally unexpected moments, and it is looking at, of course, the role of peasants. It is looking at the Great War. It is looking at the revolution and basically the making of the Soviet Union. But what we're going to hear today is something completely different, and that is the first of 3 lectures titled Sphere of Influence, A History of the Present. Today's lecture is concerned with the gift of geopolitics, how worlds are made and unmade. It's going to be about the nature of course, interstate rivalry, and whether we should be worried about the return of geopolitics. But I think the background to the trilogy of lectures is the idea that we need to rethink the nature of the liberal order in the rules-based liberal order, international order established during the Cold War, and look at it also as a moment which has been the formation and the disciplining of American power. And the question is, was this a very short conjuncture, or are we seeing an alternative to the older idea of spheres of influence? The second lecture is on the difference between, if there is, and if there is one, what is the difference between fascism and communism? And the third one will deal with populist revolts more globally. So a warm welcome to you again, and we're going to hear the first lecture on the gift of geopolitics, how worlds are made and unmade.
This one
And not that one, but
let's get
sorry,
back.
I shouldn't walk
It's okay.
off.
It could be better without the notes.
I'm sorry, this is not the most elegant of entries and exits.
Good evening. When I was younger, which actually was not that long ago, we had Steve Jobs, we had Johnny Cash, and we had Bob Hope. Now, that's right, no jobs, no cash, no hope. I know what you're thinking. What's going to happen if Kevin Bacon dies? That's it. Might as well give up completely. No bacon. First, let me say thank you for the honor of the invitation. You know, Jan Wienermuller, who gave the lectures last year, as that distinguished political theorist actually based at Princeton University, he's here this year, but when he saw that I was giving these lectures, he fled the country. He's not in Austria right now. Ivan Krastyev, who is a permanent member of the Institute, who invited me to give the lectures, also vanished from the country days before I arrived. Shalini tried to escape, and she hurt herself and didn't get out. You can see the injury to her leg, which is evidence of her attempted escape. So what explains why you're here, I don't know. Everyone else, it seems, understood. We do these distinguished lectures at my home institution, Princeton University, the sequence of 3 distinguished lectures, and I have to say, it is the principal way that we deflate people's reputations. We invite a famous person. They come thinking they must say something profound. They attempt to say something profound, and you can just see the reputation deflating in the room. The second lecture has half the number of people as the first, and they are even more angry because they came to the second. And then the third lecture is a dialogue between the host and the lecturer. Maybe it works differently here. Yes, we will. Exactly what I was thinking. Anyway, my reputation will also deflate, but I have the fortune of not having such an inflated reputation to begin with, so the deflation can only go so far. I also have the advantage that I can avoid the profound and focus only on the banal, which is what I'm going to do in the 3 lectures today. So let us recall the fantasy of the CIA. The CIA fantasized for decades to bring down the Soviet Union. It did all manner of covert operations. It funded the Voice of America and Radio Free Europe to try to penetrate into the censored Soviet space. It spent a great deal of American tax dollars and achieved almost no effects bringing down the Soviet Union. Then, all of a sudden, someone begins to say, the Soviet system is rotten. He decides to relax the censorship. He decides to allow information from the West to flood into the country. Forget about Radio Free Europe. How about Television Channel 1 in the Soviet Union? He decides to introduce market mechanisms and unhinges the planned economy. He deliberately sabotages the centralized rule of the Communist Party, as a result of which the federal states, the states in the Federal Union, discover that they are no longer beholden to Moscow. He forces the introduction of multi-candidate elections with secret ballot, competitive multi-candidate elections. He declares that the satellite states of Eastern Europe can go free. Not exactly. What did he say? He said, we will not defend them anymore. They're on their own. In a word, what the CIA fantasized about, but never made much progress on, the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, he did it. He did it all and then some. Things that the CIA was not even bold enough to fantasize about. He did. Still to this day, having lived through it and watched it and having been there, it shocks me. So now we have a new fantasy. The new fantasy is not the CIA fantasy. It is a kind of combination Russia, Iran, China fantasy. What would that fantasy be? It would be that someone comes along and discredits and maybe even destroys the American system. What would that someone do? That someone would say that the whole system is completely corrupt, that there are millions and millions of illegal voters, that the elections are rigged, that the courts are packed with completely biased judges, that the civil servants are saboteurs and a deep state, that the US media are, quote, enemies of the people, that the US government, quote, kills plenty of people, just like Russia's government. This person would sabotage the State Department, eliminate its budget, block all its appointments, and have his son-in-law run foreign policy. He would attack American intelligence as Nazism. Quote, he would say that states that sign mutually consensual alliances with us are cheaters, that the alliances are unnecessary burdens, even swindles, that the allies are not part of a larger community of values and interests, but freeloaders. He would say that the free trade pacts are self-sabotage. He would give all top government positions to his family members. He would promote generals to run all the key civilian posts so that an Egyptian diplomat would say, quote, you're just like us now, reporting to generals. And of course, he would use his political power to enrich himself, his properties, and his products. Yes, that was the Russian, Iran, China fantasy. And lo and behold, here we are. This is the world we live in now. The first world, the Gorbachev world, as I said, I'm still in a state of shock that the General Secretary of the Communist Party did all of that to the Soviet system and buried it. Thankfully, in many ways, because it went peacefully as a result of him. Now, Trump obviously is no Gorbachev. I think actually this entire room could probably agree on that point. And the West is also not collapsing. My point is rather that the US and the West more generally can only be undermined from within. The threat to the West, the threat to the United States, is a loss of faith and a loss of will in itself. And unfortunately, that's where we are now. Okay. Let's think a little bit about this. I'm not going to talk about, as was already mentioned, Stalin. I have been living with Stalin now for too many years. I wake up, he's in the bed next to me. I turn on the computer, it's all about him. I go to sleep at night, it's all I dream about. Fortunately, I don't live under that system, but I have made myself a captive of it. In fact, Stalin destroyed my eyesight. I can no longer see very well, but my glasses are not with me. They are unfortunately enjoying life back in New York City. I'm not going to talk about Trump either, even though that's all we talk about now in the United States. I don't know how it is here, but we talk about Trump, and then we stop talking about Trump, and somebody says, what about Trump? And it's Trump, and it's Trump, Trump and Trump, Trump and more Trump. But I swore I wouldn't do that here. After all, I fled from the US to come here, unlike those who are permanently based here or try to get out while I'm here. I'm not going to talk about Trump's breakthrough and the continuing stalemate in the US political system. I'm not going to talk about how Trump, in a single election cycle, drove a stake through the hearts of both the Bush dynasty and the Clinton dynasty. In a single electoral cycle, through the Bush dynasty and the Clinton dynasty, only to create actual family rule himself. I'm not going to talk about that. I'm not going to talk about the absence of any realignment in the political system, about how one party continues to believe deeply and sincerely that a reduction in marginal tax rates is the answer to every single question. That party is known as the Republican Party. I'm not going to talk about how another party believes that the answer to every single question is identity politics. That party is the Democratic Party. None of that has changed. We have a breakthrough and a complete stalemate, just where we were before. The difference, of course, is that Trump revealed the misalignment between the Republican Party voter base and the Republican Party donor and intellectual base. And he holds this now. And if you think they're going to get rid of him, they're going to impeach him, they're going to flush him down the bowl at the first opportunity, you don't understand that he can fracture that party. He can fracture that Republican Party because he's the one who has support in the voter base. They have support in the donor base and the intellectual class, the rest of them in the Republican Party. So it's going to be very interesting, but I'm not going to talk about that. I'm not going to talk about the nihilism of the Trump administration, the failure to appoint people on purpose to positions in the federal bureaucracy, the appointment instead of 400 campaign aides, the only people he's really appointed, 40 or 50 people on the one hand, and then several hundred campaign aides. Loyalists who planted fake stories about how Hillary Clinton was dying and concocted videos, falsifying videos to show how sick she was and how she was dying for the New Hampshire election, and are now running major departments in the federal government. One of them graduated from high school 2 years ago and is now one of the highest officials in the U.S. bureaucracy. These are known as beachhead teams. Those are the only people that this nihilistic administration trusts. And those are the only people, with few exceptions, that they've appointed. I'm not going to talk about any of that. I'm not going to talk about populism, at least not till the very end. Somehow, populism is a surprise. I've been teaching modern authoritarianism for 28 years. The combination of democratic deficit, democratic mechanisms, and political entrepreneurialism is an ancient story. The formula, the will of the people, the corruption of the elites, the strong man who alone can set things right. I know that story. I'm writing 3 volumes about it. In any case, we often lose sight of the fact that populism brings salutary effects because it brings suppressed issues to the fore. It gives voice to people who are otherwise not part of the political system. It doesn't bring solutions, but it does serve a democratic purpose. I'm not going to talk about any of that. So what am I going to talk about? I think we have a little bit more time before questions. Is that right? Got to watch the clock. What am I going to talk about? Silly old me, I told you it would be banal. Truth in advertising. I'm going to talk about success. In fact, these 3 lectures are going to be about success. I know. Think back to the world in the mid-70s. 4 or 5 of you, like me, were alive then, I can see, looking out at the audience. Think back to the period of the 70s. The oil shock. You remember the oil shock? Price of oil went up 400% in a few months. Remember the oil shock? I do. Remember the Vietnam War? I remember the Vietnam War. Remember when North Vietnam seized South Vietnam in 1975? I remember that. Remember Watergate and Richard Nixon? I remember that. Remember Mao and the Cultural Revolution? The murderous, insane Cultural Revolution of Mao? I remember that. You remember Greece had a military junta? Remember Franco in the 70s for a time was still alive and still in power? Remember Japan suffered its first post-World War II recession in the 70s? I remember that. Remember Brezhnev? Remember Brezhnev drooling on himself? I remember that. It was on French TV, which they couldn't control. He was overdosing on sleeping pills because he had insomnia, an illness that set in during the Prague Spring events when he ordered the tanks to go in. He didn't want to do it. Felt he had no choice. Remember the economic reforms announced by Kosygin, which vanished without a trace, just like Kosygin would do? I remember all of that. I remember Eastern Europe lived under communism. I remember going to Prague and Brno. And I remember people thought they would live under communism with no end in sight. They couldn't get out, and they had no future that they envisioned, especially young people. I remember all of that. I remember the 70s very well. There were some things in the 70s. In 73, the European community expanded. You remember that? The original 6, who'd they add? Ireland, Denmark, and the UK, with Gibraltar, were added in 73. This brought the European community to 9. If you projected the world forward from the 70s, would you have been optimistic? Would you have thought that anything good was coming? Would you have thought that the West was the future rather than the past? Would you have foreseen the repudiation of Mao and the introduction of markets and massive wealth in the monsoon rice cultivation areas of southern China? I didn't foresee any of that. Would you have foreseen the collapse of the Soviet Union? The expansion of the European Union to nearly all of Europe, not 6 or 9, but 28 minus 1. I didn't see that. Would you have foreseen the life expectancy we now have on a global scale? The health, the middle-class property ownership, the poverty reduction. 1.3 billion people lifted out of poverty by official statistics. 1.3 billion people lifted out of poverty. It's not just in China. I didn't foresee that. Quote, the past 250 years have witnessed the most spectacular increase in human well-being in history. The economies of China and India, accounting for 1/3 of the world's population, have seen growth rates that are unparalleled in any country, supporting recent expansions in global living standards. Life expectancy in most parts of the world has soared on the back of achievements in child mortality. A child born in sub-Saharan Africa today is more likely to live to the age of 5 than a child born in the UK at the beginning of the 20th century. That's my colleague, Angus Deaton, in his book, The Great Escape. He won the Nobel Prize for economics. Strange as it might seem, life now is better than at any time in recorded history. More people are better off, and fewer people live in poverty. lives are longer, children die at a much lower rate. One could also add, and I know you don't believe this either, that this is the safest period in recorded history as well. Now, as one of today's preeminent philosophers said, that's Louis C.K. Louis C.K. put it best. He said, quote, "Right now, everything is amazing and nobody is happy," unquote. So in a way, I have many other Louis C.K. quotes, but I'm going to restrain myself. In a way, that's what we need to talk about. We need to remember that we've had success, and we need to do something with the success that we've had, because we're allowing it to slip from our grasp. Now, you'll tell me that not everything is so great, right? That there are a lot of people living in poverty still. Obviously. That goes without saying. We're not talking about the elimination of poverty. We're talking about averages. There's a problem with averages, right? Everybody knows there's a problem with averages. You put your head in the oven, you put your feet in the fridge, and on average, you're comfortable. Right? Yes. Well, I agree. There is that problem with averages. The U.S. had 13 billionaires in 1980. It's got 540 billionaires today, from 13 to 540. In the 1960s, the ratio of CEO pay to the pay of the workforce in the leading 350 companies was 20 to 1. 20 CEO pay to 1 worker pay on average. By 2016, that ratio was 300 to 1. One could also note that unions have dwindled. They were already only 1/3 of the U.S. workforce in 1960. They are 1/10 of the U.S. workforce in 2016. We could go on with those kind of statistics, and they're important, and they tell you something. CEOs making 300 to 1, the pay in their companies, is a big change from just a few decades ago. Now, of course, where I sit in the university, there's a very loud, passionate cry for more female and black CEOs in those 350 companies, so that women and blacks also can make 300 times what the workers make. And when you point out that that might not have much of an effect on the people known as Americans, you are a misogynist. So like I say, you can look at this any way you want, but there is an underlying story, which is one of success. The problem is we weren't ready for success. The G7, at its height, accounted for almost 70% of GDP. It peaked at just under 70, the G7. What does the G7 account for now? 47% of global GDP. So the G7 countries have only gotten richer, immensely richer than they were. But their share of global GDP is dropping like a stone. That's called success. There's no other word for that. Somehow, however, as I said, we were not ready for this success. Now, the most dramatic success, of course, has been in China. China's GDP in 1979, 261 million. China's GDP today, about 12 trillion. China per capita income in 1979, $270 a year, average income for someone, an inhabitant of China in 1979. Nominally today it's 7,500. Purchasing power parity, it's 14,000. China's income, overall national income, its total economy, in nominal dollar terms, is now 60% of the US. In 1992, China was 6% of the US economy. In 2007, China was 25% of the US economy. That's right, China is now the world's #1 manufacturer, #1 exporter, and #1 consumer market for oil, vehicles, smartphones, and down the line. Meanwhile, we can't figure out how to provide economic and social opportunity for the lower middle class and the middle class anymore. We can't figure out how to defend democracy. We have a problem. Success came, the rest of the world advanced. That was the world we were hoping for. That was the breakthrough. The end of communism, China going to a market economy. Okay, it's Leninist market economy, but nonetheless, the people are certainly better off in a big way. I could add stories from the rest of the world. In addition, Mexico, now a middle-income country and a complete success. And you out there can name all the others that you know better than I do. So how could it be all of this success with the caveats, and yet nobody is happy, as Louis C.K., the preeminent philosopher of our day, said? Well, over the course of the next couple of lectures, I'm going to try to explain that. The rest of the lecture today, I'm going to set some of the building blocks for that explanation. I think I'm actually okay with time so far. So, one of the things I encounter all the time, I study geopolitics and power. I've written a whole bunch of books, and they're always about the same thing, geopolitics and power. That's what these lectures are going to be about, because to the extent I know anything, it's only that. Americans, and especially Europeans, have long tended to think of geopolitics as a kind of primitivism to be transcended, right? Escape from geopolitics, somehow transcend geopolitics. There's a right-wing version of this and a left-wing version. The right-wing dream is a fantasy of universal democracy, right? Everybody looks like America, and supposedly benign US-led hegemony, right? The left-wing version is very different. It's a world order governed by supranational institutions with pooled sovereignty. That's how you, quote, escape geopolitics, unquote. What both the left-wing and the right-wing version share is a conviction that the rivalry of states, which obviously have conflicting interests and conflicting worldviews, produces only conflict, insecurity, impoverishment. Hence, the return of geopolitics is always to be lamented. I don't know how many times I pick up some august journal in the US, and there's some incredible deep lament about the return of geopolitics. States begin to act according to their interests, which don't coincide with the interests of other states. Should a return of geopolitics be lamented? Do we really want to escape from geopolitics? In fact, there is no return. It never went away. And there is no escape. The West is the greatest sphere of influence that has ever been constituted. It's a kind of, when I said, a banal point. No denying that that's what it is. But the West is a sphere of influence. And we forgot that. We forgot to talk about it that way, and to defend it that way, and to defend it against others who would undo it. Interstate rivalry can obviously unleash cataclysm. We know our history. But the wealthy democratic West arose not in spite of geopolitics, but as a result of geopolitics. The question is therefore not whether geopolitics is escapable or bad, but obviously the question is, how can you harness the interstate frictions to push the major powers not towards war, but towards security and towards prosperity. Let's think about the period both before the 1940s and the period after. So Great Britain beat the French in 100 Years' War. Once Napoleon abdicated for the second time, it was a decisive victory for the British. It was kind of bizarre that a country which was much smaller population certainly, could beat a country like France. But that's kind of what happened. And then we began to live in a British-dominated world. The British created a world market economy. Now, did they create a fair world market economy? Did they create an equal world market economy? Did they create a world market economy that was friendly towards small and powerless countries? No, that's not what they did. Not at all. But nonetheless, they created a world economy. And the British-dominated world, and it was more and more a British-dominated world over time, had a couple of eruptions. One eruption was on the European continent when Bismarck unified Germany. That was a big head-spinning turn. All of a sudden, a new dynamic power on the continent. Another eruption was Meiji Restoration in Japan. This was not a new country the way Bismarck's Germany was. Japan had existed before, but it was reoriented, much more dynamic. And like Germany, it went on to an industrial spurt and what could be called a forward, and in some people's eyes, aggressive external policy, right? And I could go on. The United States, which was already the largest economy in the world in 1900 and probably in 1880, was not a major part of the international system yet in the British-dominated world because trade was only about 5% of U.S. GDP, and the U.S. had this gigantic continent itself that it could absorb. But nonetheless, it was looming over the international system. Now, why do I bring up this well-known history? It's because it was the competition among these different states that produced the things that we hold dear. For example, science and engineering. Right? If you have ships and I don't have ships, you're going to show up at my door and you're going to tell me how to live. You're going to say, you know what? I'd like your resources. I'd like to enslave your population. I'd like everything you have. And I'd like to pay as little, maybe even nothing. In fact, maybe you'll pay for it when I take it. Right? And so anybody who wanted to survive in the unsentimental, brutal international order had a choice. It could do like the British. For example, it could build ships. It could build tanks. It could found engineering schools. It could expand universities. It could integrate the polity so that the population felt part of something larger and do something called a national culture. Create solidarity. All of these attributes we call modern or modernity, modern attributes. But this was not a socio-political process where you go from tradition to modernity. This was a geopolitical process where you either do it or you become subjugated. Germany was able to do it, Japan was able to do it, and a handful of other countries were able to do it. And it produced the modern world. It produced also a lot of grief. So that was the period before World War I and then through World War I. The period after 1940s is quite interesting. You still have the state-to-state competition. Sometimes it doesn't seem that way, but you do. But you also have the creation of a liberal, rules-based international order, but that did not take shape because of high-mindedness. It was a classic sphere of influence. Moreover, it was inspired and sustained by a comprehensive Cold War with the Soviet Union, or what used to be called the Second World. Remember the First World, and the Second World, and the Third World? That was sphere of influence thinking. The First World against the Second World in competition for the Third World. Yes, it was. Now, this sphere of influence, known as the West, played a very significant part in European integration. The Europeans did integration. The Americans didn't do European integration. But there's no question that the idea of the West, the idea of a unified sphere of influence, the idea of geopolitical competition was a part of that story. It gave additional impetus in the United States to desegregation, to civil rights, because you had to live up to the promises of the first world. And if you didn't, courageous people in the streets reminded you of the need to do that. In fact, the sphere of influence, known as the West, even disciplined American power. During the Cold War, America did many things that I personally am not proud of, and that I'm sure you have a critique of. But nonetheless, America understood, more or less, that it was part of something bigger than itself, and that it was necessary to remain part of that, because that's where the power came from. There was even an American grand strategy, which, good luck now, trying to get a grand strategy in Washington. And I'm talking about since 1991, not just since the last couple of months. So, we have this kind of paradox. When geopolitics works the way we kind of like the world to be, we deny that it's geopolitics. And when geopolitics works in ways that are less benign, that's when it's bad, it's returning, and we don't want to deal with it. I would submit to you that we're dealing with some misconceptions, and that these misconceptions are non-trivial. They help explain part of our predicament, our inability to defend who we are and what we are. One misconception is that the Cold War was an era of predictability, stability, and relative peace. You know that misconception? I can tell you, the Cold War was totally unpredictable. There were crises all the time. There was risk of Armageddon several times, and not just during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the famous one. There were more than 100 wars around the world during the Cold War. Many more wars than since the Cold War ended. 1 million Vietnamese died. 1 million Afghanis died. That wasn't exactly predictable, stable, and relative peace, was it? The second misconception I would point to is that the current moment is one of profound instability, profound unpredictability, and war. I got to tell you, that's just not true. There is a lot less war now than there was during the Cold War. And there's a lot more predictability than there was during the Cold War. I'd be happy to go into various different examples to illustrate those points. A third misconception, I'll only do 3, is the so-called clash of civilizations. This is my favorite one because this is the panic that sets in when poorer and darker parts of the world begin to gain a little bit of power and say in the international system. That's known as a clash of civilizations. I just don't think that's true. I don't think there's a clash of civilizations. What people are saying when they say the contemporary world, our world now, is, quote, dangerously unstable, what they're saying is that they have now television 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with 600 channels. That's what they're saying. We're lucky we didn't have that during the Cold War. Can you imagine 24/7, 600 channel television about the nuclear Armageddon incidents when we almost fired at them and they almost fired at us? Now, having fought and won the very difficult Cold War, the West is poised somehow to lose the post-Cold War. This is absolutely astonishing. The Cold War was extremely difficult. Communism was a menace. It was a menace predominantly to its own people. The Cold War was necessary. It was not a misunderstanding. Not everything in the Cold War was necessary. Not everything in the Cold War was beneficent. But nonetheless, It was difficult and necessary, and the Western sphere of influence won that Cold War. And now we have the post-Cold War, and we're on the precipice of losing it. Frankly, I'm completely puzzled by this, how we could have gotten into this astonishing situation. So the topic of my Sphere of Influence 3 lectures is either having an international order or not having one, because that's what we currently face. When you have an international order, you can criticize it. The Americans don't understand this, the Americans don't understand that, the Americans shouldn't do this, the Americans shouldn't do that. That criticism is necessary and important. But when you don't have an international order, you can't really criticize it. That's the path that we're on. We were on that path before Trump, and we're on that path now. I've got a couple of slides. I didn't know how big a dud the lecture would be. So I've got a couple of slides to talk about sphere of influence, if it's okay. I still think we're all right on time. No? I was told. All right, let's see what I got. Oh, by the way, this is a course that I give, and this is the exam, History and Geography. I'm sorry you can't see it, but it says name the smaller rivers that run into the Nile, and the person put the answer, the juveniles. The second question here, name 6 animals that live specifically in the Arctic, and they wrote for the 6 animals, 2 polar bears and 4 seals. Yeah, $65,000 a year, Princeton University. That's how we grade in the U.S. A is what you get for showing up, because you're paying that kind of money. And F is what you get when you can't answer the questions in my class. Okay, so here we've got 3 current spheres of influence, don't we? We have Russia in Eurasia. God, that seems so big. We have China in East Asia, and we have Iran in the Middle East. Had I had more time, I would have put in India. India scrambles it a little bit because India has a democratic government. So their sphere of influence is analogous in some ways to these 3, but their political system is different, which makes it a more complex lecture. Maybe we'll get that into the book if this ever becomes a book. All right, so here's a map of the Middle East. You can see Iran, and you can see the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, right? Now, the Shia are the darker green, and the Sunni are the lighter green. And you can see that it lines up pretty well. The Shia are on this side in kind of an arc, and the Sunni are on the underside in kind of an arc, right? So if you were thinking about a sphere of influence, the proxy war between Iran and Saudi, you would say to yourself, they're stalemated. They're stalemated. Neither one, including Iran, can possibly dominate the whole region. And the reason they're stalemated is not because of anything they did or didn't do. It's because of the different color circles. The light color circles are Sunni. The dark color circles, as I said, are Shia. So Iran's influence is inherently limited. And so if you understand this, what would you do? You would make an agreement, even not necessarily a very good one, to make sure Iran didn't get a nuclear bomb. Because once you take the nuclear bomb out of Iran's hands, then you get the Sunni-Shia divide, right, to hold Iran down. That doesn't mean that Iran can't do many things. It can. It can finance Hezbollah. It can do many, many things, right? But nonetheless, the strategic thinking, as long as they don't have the bomb, well, you know, they can't dominate their region as much mischief as they might want to cause. Now, this is not to say that Iran is evil and Saudi is good. I take no stance on either one, who's good and who's evil. Iran is a fantastic, incredible civilization. If you've been to any art museum that worth the name of an art museum and walk through the whole thing, you invariably come to a section that is absolutely mind-blowing. And it's Persian culture, right? That's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about who's better or worse as people or whose culture is significant or insignificant. It's an incredible civilization. We're talking about geopolitics and balance of power. Now, you can say that the nuclear deal was very one-sided and was not well negotiated and all sorts of critiques of the nuclear deal. But if you understand geopolitics and the ability to dominate or not dominate a region, this map is all you need to see. Okay, here's another important map. There are 32 million people, as you know, live in Kurdistan. But Kurdistan doesn't exist. And until this question burns itself all the way through that Middle Eastern map, you got mayhem as far as the eye can see. Until there's a resolution of this question, you know the Kurds were promised a state in the Versailles Treaty. It never happened, right? So, but this question is about Turkey, it's about Syria, it's about Iraq, it's about Iran, it's also even about Armenia, right? So if you're thinking about getting involved in the Middle East, this, whatever you do, is going to burn and burn and burn. Because should they get to the point where they get their Kurdistan, the Iraqi Kurds and the Turkey Kurds, they don't agree on what Kurdistan should look like. So that's when they get to have a civil war about what Kurdistan should look like. So you can project this forward, as any person, elementary geopolitics would, and you can say to yourself, do I want to get anywhere near this? Do I want to be involved in this? Or if you're a humanitarian and you say, you know, many people are dying, this is a terrible situation, how can I get involved? And the answer is, you can't stop the bleeding, no matter how much aid you bring, unless you can resolve this political, geopolitical question. You can only kind of help the people in need, but you cannot get to peace and prosperity unless 32 million people are somehow wiped out, which I hope is not going to happen. So this is sphere of influence thinking, right? We saw the Sunni-Shia divide. Now we see this underlay under the Middle Eastern map. Every one of these states is in play, its geography, its integrity, because of this Kurdistan problem. I could list other issues. The Kurdistan one is one of the biggest. I'm just pointing out what the Middle East looks like. Okay. Now we come to the Russian sphere of influence. Very, very well known, right? In our face every day, in the news all the time. Transnistria, which is a Boris Yeltsin era, right? 1992 confection. Then, of course, there's the Abkhazia, South Ossetia, dismembering of Georgia, Eastern Ukraine, and Crimea. You'll notice that there's not a blotch yet over here. So this is the one that you will live to see. Is next. Yes. Because if there's a wallet on the table, you put your wallet on the table, and you leave the room, and I'm still in the room, and I'm looking at that wallet, and it's just open and sitting on the table, I might be tempted to take it. If, however, there's a wallet in your pocket, and your pocket has a zipper, and the name of the zipper is Article 5, I may or may not think I'm going to get into that pocket to take what's in there. You see, because I have a wallet that's on the table, unguarded. And so that other one that's zipped up, which says Article 5, you know, NATO, Article 5, right? I may take that, but I think I may take this one first. Okay. But overall, this represents what looks like a lot, but is, you know, in terms of Russia's sphere of influence, not very much. The crazy thing about Russia's sphere of influence is that it doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. Russia exercises influence only in the territories it directly controls. It does not exercise influence in the post-Soviet space. Have you traveled there? Some of you are from there. The influence is declining, the Russian influence. Here's the Eurasian Union, their supposed answer to the EU, right? And this is 2014, so before the ruble crash. All these economies, they have a similar effect when Russia goes down. Now, do you see the Kyrgyzstan economy? You don't see it, right? Because there isn't one, unfortunately. You have more than 33% of the economy is remittances from Russia, and that's in official GDP. Who knows what the reality is? Because it's very hard to measure, right, all the cash transactions in a way that's honest. You see the Armenian economy? I can't see it either. The Belarus economy sort of registers. The Kazakhstan economy has done significantly better. And the Russian economy, when it was valued at about 2 trillion. In nominal dollar terms, GDP now, you're lucky if you can get 1.3 trillion valuation for the Russian economy, right? 1/15 the size of the US economy. That's the Russian economy. The Soviet economy at peak was 1/3 the US economy. Russia's is 1/15 the US economy right now. So it's kind of crazy. The Russian sphere of influence, yes, we know about this. And this is not the end of the story, as I'm suggesting. But then there's this too. So they actually don't really have a sphere of influence, although they're constantly asking for it, and we constantly refuse, rightly so, to grant it. The West cannot prevent Russia from destabilizing its neighbors, but it does not accede to handing over the sovereignty of its neighbors to Russia. It's a similar situation like during the Cold War. Here's a bigger problem, though. This is the nuke table. See Russia, 7,700 approximately, right? That includes some in storage, so-called stockpiles. They're not really in storage, right? Okay, and then you see China's nuclear arsenal? Yeah, right. So this is the problem right here. And you know Russia's military doctrine is that if they're losing a conventional war, they will use nuclear weapons to avert defeat. So they cannot be defeated in a war because they have the nuclear weapons to use, meaning, and their nuclear weapons work, unlike some of these other nuclear weapons. We don't know, right? This one we don't know. This one we're not sure about some of them. Anyway, so that's the problem, and this is the problem too. This is a picture from the bedroom of a 17-year-old Russian who has no shampoo, but who can hack into the global network, and this is what their computer system looks like, managing thousands of computers, bots in other countries. Right? Russian hacking is different from Chinese hacking. Chinese hacking is they do 1 million attacks all at once, and if one gets in, it gets in. The Russians do pinpoint attacks. They go exactly where they want. They get in, and they don't turn the malware on. They just stay, because they may need it later. So they're in JP Morgan, and they're in Goldman Sachs, just in case they want to shut Wall Street down. It's a very different kind of hacking from the Chinese hacking. We have a very false impression. However, of course, this is a problem. Right? Okay. Now let's spend the rest of the time. I'm going to spend about 10, 15 minutes on China, and then we'll close up. I think I'm still okay on time. You never know with an audience. You know, George Bush, remember George Bush? Who could be nostalgic for George Bush, right? Remember George? One day, there he is in front of the White House, and who appears but Moses? Yep, it's Moses. And Bush takes a double take. Huh? Could that be Moses? And Bush yells out, "Hey, Moses!" Moses turns around and starts running the other way as fast as he can. Disappears. And Bush can't understand it because he's religious, practicing Christian. He goes to church. He wanted to meet Moses and he couldn't. Forget about it. About a week later, however, there is Bush on the White House grounds, and there's Moses again. And Bush was a bit of an athlete, and he decides now he's going to run. So he says, hey, Moses. Moses starts running, and Bush starts running too. He runs and runs and runs after Moses and grabs him on the leg and tackles him. And he says, Moses, what's the deal? Why are you running away from me? And Moses looks at Bush and he says, the last time I spoke to a bush, 40 years in the desert. There reaches a point in every lecture where you've lost the audience. You're going on about some nonsense like sphere of influence or geopolitics or whatever the latest claptrap is in the American university system. And the audience comes eager to learn. You're almost 45 minutes in. The coffee is worn off, everything's worn off, and they're not there anymore. And you got the punchline coming. That's where we are right now. I hope. So if you look at this map, the first thing you see is China has more borders than any other country in the world. It's got 20 borders, 14 on land and 6 on sea. Right? It's also got disputes with many of those neighbors over the borders. You can also see, as I'll discuss in the third lecture, that China has no California, which is its principal geopolitical lack. But today, what we want to talk about is, here's a different geography, right? US, if you're going to be a superpower, which geography do you want? That one or that one? How about Canada, Mexico, fish, and fish? You take that one? I would take this one. This one is a harder one. They're completely hemmed in, right? They're hemmed in by US bases here, 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 right? Taiwan, here, Palawan, right? The base in the Philippines. And then they're hemmed in on this side. Desert, which is growing, and ethnic unrest, which supposedly they're managing. All right, so the US and China story, they're incomparable, right? US GDP is still significantly higher than China's GDP. Purchasing power parity doesn't explain the weight you have in the world, the geopolitical weight you have in the world, right? Even per capita, if you use purchasing power parity, right, the disparity is colossal. If you use something called inclusive wealth is a greater concept than GDP. You can see the disparity is greater still. Inclusive wealth is roads, buildings, machines, human capital, natural capital, right? The wealth of the United States and the wealth of China are incomparable, right? The US also has the global system of alliances, the deep financial markets, the dollar reserve currency, the English language, right? The Chinese don't have any of this. Okay. The US also still, although it's eroding, right, has command of the commons for the most part. Not the same command they had 15 years ago, but they still have command. Okay, this is a map of US military bases in the world. It didn't come out that well, but it covers just about the whole thing. This is the US ability to project military power, to have radar installations, listening installations, right? There's never been a military like this, whose footprint is completely global. And moreover, it's that way on just a few percentage points of GDP. Right? The US military is mobile. It can go anywhere in a moment's notice. The Chinese military is not mobile. It's the big, hulking, Soviet-style armor, ready to crash across somebody's border. They're moving now from that kind of heavy armor military to a mobile one, which is about aircraft, it's about amphibious landings, that is to say, it's about ships, right? It's about projection of power over distance. The US has all that already and more. Okay, but here I realize you can't see this map. Maybe if there weren't a light, directly on the podium. We might be able to see it. Yeah. So this is a map. You saw this in the Financial Times, right? These are China's ports where they have a significant ownership stake globally. Right? In other words, you saw the US military bases and you see the Chinese ports. And lo and behold, they're the same map. The difference is that the Chinese, right, have trading ports now. Some are still projected, right? Some are Hong Kong companies. Many of them are private companies. But nonetheless, this is the capacity that is already in place for the most part that the Chinese have built globally. Moreover, there's a piece of this which are what we call dual use. Dual use means you build a shipping port that can handle trade, and then it becomes a military port that can handle big ships, for example, destroyers, cruisers, right? The Chinese built their first overseas military base in Djibouti, in Africa. They deny that it's a military base. They call it a logistical facility. Where's the main US military base in Africa? Djibouti. That's right. So the map of trading ports where they have a controlling stake is now becoming a map of potential military bases. By the way, that's completely logical. Okay. Here's the share of world trade, right? This is Mao. See that? There's Mao, and then this is Deng and his successors. So now China has a greater leverage, greater international leverage, because, as I said, they're the number one trading partner of about 43 countries, and the US is the number one trading partner of about 32 countries. Okay, South China Sea, you know that story, right? They claim 95% of the South China Sea, and they call it a core interest, which is the same language used for Taiwan. That tells you that they're going to go to the wall for the South China Sea. You should have no illusions when they say something is a core interest. They mean it. Absolutely. Okay. President Xi Jinping, you remember, famously said they don't intend to pursue militarization. And here's the American understanding of that, right? That China seeks hegemony in East Asia. Simple as that. Okay. So here's that famous South China Sea with the 9-dash line, right? And as you can see, here's the Philippines, right? Vietnam, right? And there's China's claiming all of this territory. You know the Paracels, the Scarborough and the Spratly, right? That's where they have the coral reefs that are now military bases. So the incredible feats of will and engineering in the Spratlys, right? We now have 7 artificial islands. Several are military bases, right? We have Subi Reef, larger than Pearl Harbor. Right? There was nothing there before. Now it's larger than Pearl Harbor. Mischief Reef, Fiery Cross. I'm going to show you Fiery Cross in a second with the 10,000-foot runway. And then, you know, the Paracels, they get the radar stations, the surface-to-air missiles. There used to be, right? Rocky Outcrop, Scarborough Shoal. They haven't built it yet. They just seized it so far. But it's coming. Anybody has any doubts, it's coming. Okay, so this Scarborough Shoal, which is not built up yet, is 140 miles from Manila. That just tells you how close this stuff is. Right? Okay, so here is Fiery Cross Reef. You see the coral? 2014, 2015, 2016. That's what the Chinese can do. They just seized it, violate international law, and they just militarized it, and they built this base, and they have a 10,000-foot runway on Fiery Cross Reef. 2 years. 2 years. So that's where we are. That's the world we live in today. The Chinese sphere of influence in East Asia is a serious one. They're playing for keeps. You may say that's fine. It's totally okay. The Chinese are a great people. They have an incredible civilization. I would agree with all that. They are a great people. They do have an incredible civilization. It's just they don't really have a transparent political system. Okay. So enduring shifts in the global balance of power are extremely rare, but when they happen, they are momentous. That's the world we live in now. Momentous times. Large-scale wars, they're always predicted the day after on cable television. right? They're only obvious post facto, right? And even business as usual triggers large-scale conflict. That's what history shows. And we have Chinese opacity. We have American, whatever you want to call it, ignorance and competence. That's the world we're in right now. And all war is miscalculation by decision makers. Wars don't happen unless an order is given, buttons are pushed, right? World War I, sleepwalk into war. There were 1,000 orders just to move the horses and the fodder for the horses. You can't fight a war, right, without orders. 1,000 orders alone just to move the horses and the fodder. You can't sleepwalk into war. You got to give orders to have war happen, right? But it's often miscalculation. All right, so there's our world. We have some historical cases. Remember the rise of German power in Europe? That's an important historical case. Remember the rise of Japanese power in East Asia? Another important historical case. Remember the rise of US power globally? Slightly different because the British yielded, as it were. They surrendered to the rise of US power with that phony nonsense about the special relationship and other ruses, right? So China, we don't know. Like none of the above, it doesn't depend on China alone. Right? Okay. China's rising in a US-dominated world. That we do know. Okay. So US remains the key variable. Eras of omission, commission, domestic politics, right? This is where we are. So we have fateful choices for Washington. Can American primacy be preserved or restored? Should it even be preserved? Maybe enough is enough. Should we keep the current alliances? Should we let them go? Should there be new structures? Right? Should we just accommodate China in East Asia, Russia in Eurasia, and Iran in the Gulf by granting the spheres of influence? That's what they want. That's what they're pushing for. Or should we try to contain them and rebuild a 350-ship American fleet? Right? Those are the choices in front of the American people right now. Right? Is there maybe a new equilibrium in each region? Or are we actually headed for confrontation in each region? Can we find containment and cooperation and delicate calibration? Strength and diplomacy, can we respect others' interests and values while we uphold our own? This is what's at stake. That's how many people live right now in East Asia and South Asia. Right? Doesn't look like much if you put it on a regular world map, but how about if you put it on a world map by size of the country based on population? Right? That's not what China looks like. That's not what Russia looks like. That's what they look like if you do territory in terms of people. Right? So that's where all the marbles are, as they say. Right? That's where the game is now. Right there. Okay. Now. That's the slide I know when the lecture is over. When that slide comes up, I'm done. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm terribly handicapped, so I'm not going to say much because I need to sit down immediately. But thank you for this really sweeping global view of maybe 100 years of history. And with that, let me just open the conversation so I am able to sit down, turn to Holly, who will have the first word.
Do I call on, or you, who calls on the hands that get raised?
You could just
Okay.
but Anne also knows most of the people here. So it's
Okay,
fine.
I know Holly as well.
Okay. You know.
My question is quite simple. It's what do you mean by power? Because at the very end of the lecture, you had the slide with the 3.7 billion.
Yes.
Earlier on in the lecture, you had who has more nuclear weapons.
Yes.
And earlier on, you had who has how many. What percentage of the population is Shia versus what percentage of it is Sunni? When it comes to geopolitics, how do you measure power?
Thank you. Excellent question. I should have stated that at the beginning. or at some point. So power is about your ability to mobilize people and resources towards whatever the strategy, the grand strategy you have. Having a grand strategy already is power. For example, preserving the EU. That would be a grand strategy. And the ability to mobilize people and resources on behalf of that grand strategy, that would be power. You can do that in many different ways. You can do that with what they call hard power. You can do that with what they call soft power, right? Hard power would be things like military assets, ships, right? Soft power would be the power of example, the power of persuasion, the power of alliances, right? So there are a number of ingredients. They have to do with the openness and dynamism of your economy, how much wealth you're producing, how many resources you're mobilizing in an economic sense, having to do with the strength of your society, right? The dynamism, the openness, as well as solidarity or the absence of solidarity in your society, right? The scale of your human capital, how much, for example, you're investing in the education and the health and well-being of your population, right? And one could go on. Now, if you lack any of those, or you're low in those various indices, you can resort to what's called asymmetry. So, for example, you can't mobilize the economic and military resources of the superpower, but you can mobilize the resources of 17 to 25-year-olds who can hack. That costs you a lot less, and you can intercede in world affairs and even in sovereign affairs of other countries using that kind of asymmetric power. So there's asymmetric power also. Asymmetric power can be for positive goals, increasing the wealth and prosperity of your own population, for example. We don't see that. We see instead spoliation, right? We see spoliation meaning putting your stick in somebody else's eye and feeling good about that. Right? That's how asymmetric power is currently being used. We have this story of the next lecture, the second lecture, about a story about these exact questions of how the U.S. and East Asian sphere of influence, the U.S. sphere of influence with Europe and with Asia, did things to the Soviet Union and China, and you had different outcomes, right? That's the lecture about what is the difference, if anything, between communism and fascism. Right, that's the second lecture, so I'll go into greater examples of these kinds of things that I just outlined, to concretize them a little bit in this point. Now, the combination of attributes you would have to be as good as the most powerful country's attributes. Otherwise, that most powerful country could have the ability to boss you around. Unless that most powerful country is somehow disciplined, is somehow set in mechanisms, institutions, in a story called the West, in which case they can do harm to the less powerful, but not on the scale they could do, given their power, if they were undisciplined. We'll get to see that a little bit in the third lecture, when I talk about the nature of the Russian and Chinese sphere of influence through time, but especially today, because, as you'll know, Iran, Russia, and China are all ancient civilizations. They're all spectacular ancient civilizations. They all have tremendous sense of historical entitlement and tremendous historical grievances. They have what we call in English a chip on their shoulder, right? This grievance, this resentment. We have a politics of resentment which takes the form of domestic or national populism, and then there's an international politics of resentment, an international populism, as it were. Our vocabulary is poor to describe this, but I'll describe some of that in the third lecture. But anyway, just it's an excellent question. If that's unsatisfactory, I could give more right now, but I think there's more to come on that.
Thanks for a wonderful lecture. Would you, for us in Europe, it doesn't feel like we've been doing geopolitics for many decades, because basically the Americans did it for us. Would you agree with that? Where is Europe in this whole story?
Yeah. So there used to be Western and Eastern Europe. And Europe's example, nothing it did except being itself, was already the most significant geopolitical factor inside Eastern Europe. West Germany, East Germany, right, is the strongest example, because they could watch on the television and they were nose to nose in Berlin, right? So Europe just being itself, just being free and prosperous, being about human rights, being about social rights, right, being about democracy, being all the things, the incredible achievement of Europe, especially West Germany's achievement in the post-World War II period, right? All of that is geopolitics. Would there have been a solidarity in Poland without the achievement of West Germany post-World War II? No way. Never. Never. West Germany was the linchpin, absolute linchpin, West Germany's own internal development. We haven't even gotten to its external policies yet. Its own external development was the single most powerful geopolitical factor you can imagine. And thank God. Can you imagine if post-World War II German power looked like Russia today? Can you imagine if Germany today looked like Russia? What would be the fate of Eastern Europe? You think there's Kaczynski, you think there's Orban. I can tell you, that's baby stuff compared to what we would see if Germany looked like Russia. Eastern Europe is a strip of land lying between German power and Russian power. That's all it is. We romanticize it. You know, Havel, Power of the Powerless, you know, The Grocer, that great story. There's tremendous romanticism about Eastern Europe. But all it is a strip of land between German power and Russian power. Now, Germany then had an external policy. The EU had an external policy. It was one of exchanges, potentially investment, right? All of that was geopolitics. Absolutely. We don't like to call it that because geopolitics for us is pejorative. But part of the problem now is we need to have a forward policy. We need to have an aggressive policy. We need to push who we are, our values, and what we are against those who would undo those values. Some of that is internal, and a lot of that is external. And if you don't recognize that that's what we've been doing all along, then you kind of handicap or hold yourself back from doing it right now. That's the position we're in. We have now expanded Europe to 27 minus 1, and somehow we're paralyzed. We have this success that even the dreamers didn't think was going to happen if you were alive in the 70s. It was a big deal. Remember what happened with Norway, right? It was a big deal to get the Ireland, Denmark with Greenland, and UK with Gibraltar in 73. That was no small thing. Remember what de Gaulle did before with the UK, right? We all know that history, right? We're Europeans here. Okay. So the idea that we would get to 27 minus 1, stunning. So why is it that we now have this and we're paralyzed? And you can say there are many reasons. And I would agree that there are many reasons. And I would say one of the reasons is because we don't appreciate how we got there, and we don't appreciate what we have. We somehow were unprepared for our success. I know I'm repeating myself, but that's the theme of these lectures. Okay. Yes, sir.
Where do non-state violent actors fit into this story? I think of Al-Qaeda and ISIS.
Yeah, they fit in, they cause mischief. They feel like there's injustice. They have a story to tell. That story is believable or acceptable to those who follow them.
Just mischief or Al-Qaeda?
They think they have some of them have a positive view about what they're creating, like a caliphate. And, you know, I'm not taking a position right here. I have a position, but I'm not taking a position right here about whether it's only mischief or the caliphate is a positive vision for prosperity and stability, right? We could argue about that. Like I say, I have my position. But that stuff is, yes, it's there. I can tell you all about, in fact, Holly could tell even more about the secret societies and the underground in the Habsburg Empire. You know, starting with the one I know well, the Carbonari, right? You can say that's not analogous to the situation we have now. Well, nothing is exactly the same as the situation we have now. There was a year in Russia where terrorists killed 3,000 officials. In Tsarist Russia, terrorists killed 3,000 officials, and it wasn't even necessarily their best year, right? I mean, terrorism was a fact of life in modern Russia. It was less of a fact of life in the Habsburg Empire. That's prior to World War I, right? We're talking about Russia now. Forget about the interwar violence that comes with the war, right? So the non-state actors, we think of them as having somehow miraculously appeared and proliferated recently. And the answer to that is, once again, a television which is on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and in 600 channels. That's not to say it was always the same scale before, it was always the same phenomenon before, because things mutate, and things can rise and fall like a souffle depending on financing, right? Oil revenues, diamond revenues can finance a lot of stuff. There's a big story of the Congo. What's that, you know? I mean, is that a non-state actor, a state actor? There are many different groups that have filtered through the Congo over the last several decades and killed 5 million people. And then some of it overlaps with the jihadism in terms of the morphology of the actors in the picture. And some of it looks more like traditional state, although in its, sometimes mafia-like quality, right? Political mafia-like state. So it exists. It has been there before in different forms. I don't think it is what we make it out to be, which is to say a new phenomenon, nor a globally threatening phenomenon. It causes a lot of grief, especially for Muslims. They're the primary victims of most of these movements, right? And that grief is very real and very serious, and we can see it 24/7, and it's heart-rending. Right? But when we're talking about the rise of China, a rise of a new power in an international system, and the ability or inability of the U.S. to accommodate the rise of China in a way that's mutually stable and prosperous, we're talking about potentially the end of the world. We're not talking about 3,000 deaths or 10,000 deaths or 250,000 deaths. We're talking about the incineration of all your portfolios. You got retirement accounts? They're gone. They're vaporized. Right? That's what we're talking about. We're now in that situation. And we don't understand that we're in that situation. We're in denial that we're in that situation. That situation doesn't have to end badly. It can end really well. It can be more prosperous and stable than the situation we're in now. That's up to the people we call leaders, who sometimes fail to lead. It's up to the pressure groups that push those leaders or define the agenda for those leaders, right? The societies. But that's the world we're in now. We're in a world where the Iranian problem and the Middle Eastern problem is terribly bloody and horrific, but not of global geopolitical significance. We're in a situation where Russia has unique capabilities, but doesn't even have its own sphere of influence. It handicaps itself in many ways, as you'll hear in upcoming lectures. And then we're also in a world where China and East Asia, and then if I had had time, bringing the South Asia story into the picture too, which is crucially important, right? That's where the game is now. And India, the South Asia story, is not on the level of the China story, right? They don't have the ports, they don't have the navy. That's the, right? Chinese have 200,000 merchant ships. 200,000 merchant ships right now, right? We don't understand that because we're preoccupied with some of these other things, which take up too much space in the strategic sense, not in the humanistic sense.
I just wanted to ask you about your contention that Russia has no sphere of influence. I agree that that in a lot of the post-Soviet countries there's a lot of a deep level, understandably deep level of suspicion about Russian intentions. But I live in the sort of romantic strip of land that you mentioned.
Yes.
And in Slovakia, which I know quite well, there is, for a country that was invaded by the Soviet Union only 40 years ago, 50 years ago almost, there's a surprising degree of sympathy for Russian aims.
Yes.
And that includes among the political elite, in fact, especially among the political elite. The same is true in Hungary for different reasons. And you'll have seen, as I did, pictures of Marine Le Pen, who's possibly going to become the French president in a few weeks, meeting Mr. Putin and apparently in hock to him financially. You'll have seen Mr. Farage in Britain saying very nice things about him, and you'll have seen Mr. Trump unable, it seems, to utter a single word of criticism of Russia. So while I agree with you that the resources that you mentioned aren't as effective by Russia, they certainly seem to have, the Russian government at least, has seemed to have specialized in this asymmetric effect by which they can influence key people in countries that should be far more powerful.
Yes, your name once again?
James Thompson.
Right, James. So James, you just made my argument again. You just restated my argument. So when I said Russia has no sphere of influence, I said in the post-Soviet space, right? In the Soviet, you'll forgive me for this expression, trashcanistans, which is not an ethnic term, but is a political mafia term. In the trashcanistans, and I would include Russia and Ukraine in that category, just to show you it's not an ethnic one, you would call them rubbish rather than trash can, right? The rubbish can, but it doesn't quite have the same quality in the higher level British language as it does in the vernacular colonial language of the US. But yeah, so Russia doesn't really have the sphere of influence it's pining for in the post-Soviet space because it doesn't really have soft power and because those countries are suspicious of Russia and Belarus, like Kazakhstan, knows that Russia could annex it, right? Lukashenko has a stroke or a heart attack, or he dies peacefully in his sleep from old age, potentially, right? And then what happens to that territory, right? So yes, that's where I meant that Russia has... We're exaggerating Russia's level of influence. They have a level of influence, but a lot of it is negative. The problem is that they have influence way beyond that sphere. They have an influence in our sphere. That's our sphere of influence. That's us, right? Or that's what we used to think as us. That's territory we used to defend and try to integrate into who we are and uphold democracy and uphold open competitive economies, right? And we've stopped successfully competing with the Russians in those areas. They're beating us with fewer resources, right? Significantly fewer resources. It's astonishing how fewer their resources are. And yet their influence is rising in all those places and ours is declining. We're not doing something right, are we? We have a problem. We're falling down on our own sphere of influence. It's evaporating right in front of our eyes. We didn't do something that we should have done. We forgot to provide opportunity for lower class and middle class people, didn't we? We forgot that institutions which are too technocratic and not democratic enough aren't that popular over time. We forgot about that, didn't we? We have a democratic deficit, we have an opportunity deficit, and we have some other issues going on. And the Russians, they have a toolkit, right? I'll give you one close to home. I just want to check the time because, I bloviate so much I could take up the whole rest of the time with one answer. Things go off in my little head, and I just made a connection. It's like the synapses worked. So let's take Sudetenland. Let's take the Sudetenland and Czechoslovakia, right, 35, 36, 37, 38. So what did Germans do? Right? Germany was then ruled by Nazis, and they had a forward policy of intervention in that country, and they used dirty tricks. You're not going to believe this, but they planted fake news stories. They put up candidates to discredit certain parties, like they paid people to be bad and discredit certain parties. They lied, they concealed that they were working behind the scenes and that the intelligence services of Nazi Germany were supporting, for example, the Sudeten parties, right? They didn't tell the truth about that. The Czechs, the Czechoslovaks, in fact, František Moravec, who was the head of military intelligence, and had an unbelievable career. He ended up in London, and you probably know this story. He knew this because he had some agents on the German side who were leaking important intelligence. They had a very high-level agent, A-54, who was in German intelligence and was giving them these files about what they were up to. And so he could prove that the Nazi German denials of intervention, the denials of the dirty tricks were lies. And he had documentation to prove that they were lies. But you see, he lived in a democratic country. He lived in Czechoslovakia. And that was a parliamentary republic. And so he couldn't just, for example, shoot people. You know, they're walking down the street, let's assassinate them because they're our enemy and they're doing these dirty tricks and I have documents on them. He couldn't do that. The Germans could do that. They could assassinate somebody and then they could deny that they did it. But František Moravec couldn't do that. He couldn't even try them in a court of law. Even if he wanted to reveal that he had the spy and burn his spy by bringing the documents into a court, the laws weren't strong enough in Czechoslovakia. And to get the laws to be stronger for combating foreign subversion, you would have to get law through the parliament and parliamentary process, and of course the Nazis buying and selling those votes with their bribes and stuff, right? So here's a guy who knows what the enemy is doing and has documentation about it, but he can't fight them the same way. It's asymmetrical because the Nazis can do anything. There's no line they can't cross, all the way up to assassination. But Moravec, he's hamstrung because he's part of a democratic country. His system is democratic. And if you read the stuff he went through, he's constantly frustrated because he cannot resort to the tools that the Nazis are using because that makes him like the Nazis that he's fighting, and that's the whole reason he's fighting the Nazis, is not to be like the Nazis. And it's this paradox, right? So it's much harder, isn't it? It's much harder to fight against somebody who is doing a spoliation game where they can violate any existing democratic law or even norm or even morality, right? We could take this analogy much farther and talk about all the contemporary examples. We got people from Ukraine here. We had a big debate in our country, and many of people I respect demanded that we send offensive weapons to Ukraine. Ukraine was asking for the offensive weapons, and the U.S. Congress, certain members, very substantial, high-profile members in the Congress wanted to do this, and the Obama administration said no. The Obama administration didn't want anything to do with Ukraine. It wanted it to go away, right? But here's the problem. The U.S. provides offensive weapons to the courageous Ukrainians who are fighting the Russians. And the next day, the train station in Kiev blows up. It just blows sky high. And you say to yourself, the Russians must have done this. Nobody can use mass transit in Kiev. Mass transit is now completely paralyzed because people are afraid to get on anything because it might blow up. And the Russians, they say, we didn't do that. That wasn't us. You're always accusing us of underhanded, dirty tricks. Where's the proof? Show me the proof, right? Same thing with the Sudetenland with the Nazis. They kept saying, show us the proof that we're behind these. This is the sentiment of the population. This is what the people themselves are doing. This is not us. Show us the proof. And Moravec couldn't show the proof, right? So it's the same thing. So I'm not saying that it was the wrong idea to not arm the Eastern Ukrainians with offensive weapons, right? That's a policy debate. I'm not taking a position on that. I'm just suggesting that the Russians can then go to a level of escalation and a type of escalation. They can blow up the airport in Lviv. They can blow up, the university. They can bomb a hospital from the inside, covertly. They can do all this stuff, and then they can deny it. They can shut down the electric grid, right, and then deny it. Right? Now, would they have done that? I have no idea if they would have done that. Maybe they wouldn't have done that. Maybe I have a jaundiced view of the Russians. Maybe I'm being unfair to them. by thinking that they might resort to this type of behavior. All I'm saying is that, so the problem is such, right? The problem is such that the magnitude of the problem is very great. We'll see again maybe, I don't know. You go. You go. So we need to understand that that's the problem, and we need to have the will to combat it, and we need friends and allies to be involved, and we need to create a situation where people look at us again and say, that's the way I want to be. That's what I want, right? When we talk about the sphere of influence in the Eastern Bloc in the second lecture, right? There was a reason that people wanted to be that way. And it's because there was something exemplary about it. But if, you're offering them maybe less than that, you're offering them a very unequal society, or you're offering them lack of social mobility, or you're offering them a democratic deficit, or you're offering them a currency union without a fiscal union, or, you could go on. Right? You could, once again, I'm not trying, this is a nonpartisan discussion. Right? I'm not a member of any political party, and I'm not taking any political positions here. I'm just talking about we either defend our values, we either go on the offensive, we either take them on, or we don't. And don't tell me it's hard. It is hard. I know it's hard. Because they can resort to things that we can't resort to and still be ourselves. Right? So that's the challenge. The challenge is, the Russians are in France. Who else is in France? What are the French doing themselves? And what are French allies doing? Right? Now, this is a collective, multi-generational, like the Cold War, mobilization on behalf of a way in life and values. Now, every time you do something, like you invade Iraq, right, without proper justification potentially, right? Every time you do something, you destroy some more of your credibility and authority. And like I said with the opening Gorbachev-Trump example, right, that's the world we're living in now. So it's sort of doubly, triply, quadruply, thousandfold incumbent upon us to defend those values, to call out what's happening, to say who we are and what we are. Right? Otherwise, what we're doing is participating in the self-unraveling of the West. Go ahead.
That's sort of the base of my question. Why is it that so few of the American elite seem to be alarmed or surprised about the fact that Trump, for instance, has this strange relationship with Russia? I mean, with the limited exception of people like John McCain and Lindsey Graham, very few have spoken out and said, isn't this a bit strange that this guy cannot bring himself to criticize our geopolitical adversary, whether you believe that they have a sphere of influence or not, but the people, a country that shares so little of our values?
That's a really long answer, potentially.
But is it surprising to you?
Part of the answer is that more people are upset than you think. Part of the answer is that you need alternatives. See, politics is not about ideal leader and then the leader we have. Politics is the leader we have and then the alternatives who are real people. Right? So Trump won 63 million votes and more than 90% of the registered Republicans who voted. So you can say to me, Clinton won more than 65 million, etc. Well, so Clinton won 4 million more than Trump in California and 2 million more than Trump in New York. So you subtract New York and California, and Trump won by 3 million votes. Trump beat 16 challengers in the Republican primary. Right? And I got to tell you, Trump has an electoral base. Moreover, that electoral base is part of a majority in the Congress, both in the House and in the Senate. And if Trump takes away that electoral base by exiting that party doesn't have a majority potentially anymore. So there is, on the one hand, more courageous behavior than you think, On the other hand, there is also a significant understanding. If you've ever been in electoral politics, you know what it means when someone commands an electorate potentially greater than yours, including within your own party. And of course, there's a certain amount of opportunism, because some of the things Trump is doing are clearly things that members of the Republican Party have long dreamed of. Deregulation, right? Appointment of a literalist conservative Supreme Court justice, potentially, right? Those are things that they truly and genuinely believe in. They're of high value to them. That's not instrumental necessarily. They believe those things. And then you have to think about the Democratic side, right? The leader of the House for the minority party, where's she from? San Francisco, California. The leader of the Senate from the minority party, where's he from? Manhattan, New York. The leading light of opposition to Trump, the senator, where's she from? Massachusetts. That's right. So that's your opposition. California, New York, and Massachusetts. You subtract that, as I was saying, and Trump won the country, didn't he? And so the alternative party is putting up not anything representative of the nation, where the people live, where Trump got his votes. Right? They're putting up other things. And so, you know, in politics, you need viable alternatives. I feel that, you know, Trump represents a significant part of the United States. There's no question. When I said that populism is not only pejorative, right? It's the same thing with the Brexit campaign. I'm on record saying that I applauded the referendum and that I accept the vote because it revealed the sentiments of large numbers of people whose voices and views were otherwise invisible and would still be invisible today. Now, you can say the campaign was mendacious. Yes, it was mendacious. I've seen a lot of political campaigns. I've seen very few that were honest. This one was also mendacious, right? And I saw a lot of people who had no voice get a voice because of that, quote, mistaken referendum. And Trump did the same thing with the American electorate. He revealed huge numbers of people, large constituencies that were buried by the political system because the political system had failed them. And they were right. They had nothing to expect, 100% failure to vote for anybody else. And with Trump, likely 100% failure too, but possibly not, possibly something. When you have nothing to risk, when your risk is zero, meaning it's 100% bad, right? It's 100% bad with everybody else, but it could be a little bit better than that or maybe a lot better than that with Trump. And they're still with him to this day, even though there's no functioning administration in Washington, right? So there's a complexity to the Trump phenomenon that we haven't wrapped our arms around, and there's a failure of alternatives that was there before Trump was elected and is there now, right? And there are structural processes going on that predate Trump that he is accelerating but didn't create. And there is no, I mean, it's very early in the game. And even though there hasn't been a realignment of the system yet, as I opened with, Trump could possibly precipitate a realignment. His very incompetence and nihilism could potentially precipitate the realignment, right? So the Trump story, early, still unfolding, not one-sided, and scary. I think we got...
Actually, I probably have two questions, but maybe the one right now is, you got me thinking, but the people who are in Trump's camp, they have a lot to lose, actually. And what amazes me, they don't understand what they have to lose.
Tell me what they've got to lose. Go ahead.
Well, Medicare, for one thing, healthcare system, grants for communities,
Okay.
which are, you know.
Okay, so let's start with the healthcare thing. So some of the healthcare, the 20 million people who have come on to healthcare are don't have a high deductible, but a very large number of them have a high deductible. What's a high deductible? A deductible is how much of the costs you pay before the insurance begins to pay for it. So if your deductible is $5,000, the first $5,000 of medical costs you pay yourself before insurance begins to work. So a very large number of people with health insurance under Obamacare have a deductible in the thousands. So they don't actually have any health insurance right now except for catastrophic insurance. If they end up in a hospital for a prolonged stay, they get over that $5,000 or $6,000 or $4,000 limit, and the insurance begins to pay a part of the cost, not all of the cost. So they can't afford to see a doctor right now with the insurance they have. They can't, because the deductible is so high. So you know what they have to lose? You tell me what they've got to lose, right? Now, the opening budget, where everything was cut except the military, right? It's never the case. These are notional budgets. The president introduces what's called a notional budget, which has no resemblance to the final budget that becomes law, because all of the horse trading and the various different congressmen and senators get into the act and alter the existing budget. And they live in those communities. So everything that gets cut in the notional budget can potentially be restored and, in fact, increased during the budgetary process. So it's too early to say that those people are going to lose those programs. Now, if they did lose those programs, it would be significant. But we have to wait and see what the sausage making of the budgetary process looks like before they lose anything. And right now, the health care that they have is not that real. It's only real in the liberal press. Right? For the liberal press, Obamacare is extremely real. But for the everyday people in rural communities, they don't have any doctors to go to. Right? The doctor population has been depopulated. And it's really far to get anywhere near a doctor if you can afford the day off from work and then you're paying out of pocket. You can't send your kids to a doctor on that health insurance unless, they develop cancer, unfortunately, and have a prolonged stay, and then the deductible is reached and the health care kicks in. Not every policy is like that. There are some policies in Obamacare that are much better than that, right? But it's a picture that you got to be careful in characterizing it. I could say a lot more about this question, right? The problem is that we imagine what these people's lives are like. We imagine that they were fooled by Trump. We imagine that they have all these things to lose. Right? I didn't come here to talk about Trump, and I don't want to defend Trump. Right? I believe integrity has got to be the highest value of any person, and we don't have any integrity there. Right? So this is not a defense of him. This is a discussion of what it looks like to some of and many of the 63 million people who are out there. Right? It's very different looking to them. And the idea that someone came along and spoke to them, someone came along and said, the whole system in Washington is corrupt. The only counties that have gotten richer than Silicon Valley in the last 2 decades are the ones around Washington, D.C. That's a true statement. And he said that. And nobody else was saying it because they all embodied it. So the Trump phenomenon, there's a complexity there that we have to keep in mind the complexity. We have to be a little bit less partisan. That doesn't mean we be less alarmed. I think you understand my level of alarm, right? And I know many people who voted for Trump. Many people, yeah. Let me tell you a story. Once again, one question triggers.
Especially a Trump question.
Oh my God, which I swore I wouldn't talk about Trump, and look what happened. How stupid am I? I mean, maybe I didn't even take my passport to the airport and couldn't get on the plane. That's how stupid I was, right? So there was this famous film critic for the New Yorker magazine named Pauline Kael. And she was beloved by the gigantic subscription class that subscribed to the New Yorker. Beloved. And Pauline Kael, when Richard Nixon was elected president, you know what she said? She said, "That's impossible. I don't know a single person who voted for Nixon. He could have never won." And that's where we are. That's where we are. Got to talk to those people too. Those are our people too. They're British citizens. They're American citizens. They live in America. And we forgot about them. We didn't have anything on offer for them. The system was not treating them properly, and their voice was heard. Now, the solution is maybe going to be worse than the problem, right? That's what you were getting at with your question. But the problem was there, and the voice to the problem was given. And now it's kind of incumbent on us to provide an answer. And you see what the answers are, right? Or the non-answers are right now in my answer to the previous question. We put a fork in this? Is this meat done? Or we have one more?
I'll make it short.
There's time for the question, but not for the answer.
Okay. Well, I listened carefully to what you were saying. I agreed with most of what you said. I was intrigued by some of it. I was amused by some of it. But one thing made me ponder and shudder a little bit. And that was in the beginning, when you described all of the progress that humanity has made. And you made that whole convincing list. And yet you said, today we are more unhappy than we've ever been. What makes you say that? Do you think that the Chinese are unhappy? Do you think that the Russians on the whole, on the average, are unhappy?
Yes, that's an excellent question. And the answer to that is a differentiated answer, right? There are many, Louis C.K., when he said everything is amazing and nobody is happy, right? I think he may have been a little extreme in that statement. There are many people who are happy, right? For example, faculty at Princeton University, not happy. All they do is complain. Oh, I have to teach 3 hours this week. How am I going to find 3 hours in my week to teach some of these students, right? They're unhappy. I have to tell you.
That's a minority, huh?
Correct.
They're not the world.
Correct. And they're the better off people.
Yeah.
They're very well off people.
Yeah.
And yet they don't seem to be too happy about it.
I would say to hell with better off people. Huh?
Yeah, I don't begrudge people success. I'm okay with other people's success. I don't want to burn down their house just because it's bigger than mine. And it is. But, your point is, where does happiness come from, right? And we have a lot of research on happiness, which is about being part of a community, giving something back, right? Having a good marriage and children, or a legacy, if it's not children, to hand on to the future. There are a lot of dimensions to happiness, right? Happiness is not solely or exclusively, for example, your bank account or whatever it might be. So that's too big a question for me to answer. But your question was about happiness in the places that are succeeding, right? For example, in China, or in India, or in Russia, which is not succeeding. Right? We'll get to that in the next lecture. And there you also have a differentiated picture, right? Part of the problem with authoritarian regimes, right, is measuring happiness or popularity under an authoritarian regime. I'll close with this, right? So let's imagine that I'm the father in a family, and I say to my children, are you happy with this regime? Are you happy with me as a father? Am I a good father? Now, if they say no, forget about the Wi-Fi password. They're never going to get the Wi-Fi password from me. And it's not like they have another father to compare it to, and it's not like if they say no, they can get a better father. So with these authoritarian regimes, Putin is popular, Xi Jinping is popular, but they're only popular in the absence of alternatives. What you discover in an authoritarian regime is when an alternative is introduced, they might still be popular, or they might not, right? I might still be the greatest father in my kids', understanding, or if somebody else came in who was an alternative and was better, it may be that my stock went down. So to understand the opinion, the mood, the sentiment in the authoritarian regimes is more difficult than in the open societies, right?
I'm sorry, that doesn't satisfy me. because you were comparing it to the past. Well, in the past,
Yeah.
Although we probably didn't call it authoritarian regimes, but if you were to go
ahead.
and ask people, are you happy with the king? Are you happy with the emperor? They wouldn't have been able to give an honest answer either. So I was more wondering why you think the situation now is worse than it had been in the past.
Yeah. So, I'm not sure that there's a general level of unhappiness in China. If that's the answer you need for us to conclude the session, I can offer you that answer. I can offer you that answer, and I can do it in a clear conscience, because I believe that. But I'm not sure what the sentiment in Chinese society really is. That's another part of the answer. But I don't believe, if I gave the false impression, that there is a clear general level of unhappiness in that society. There is a whole lot of protest, which the regime officially records, right? Protest, however, can be about expectations as much as about unhappiness, right? So that's a complicated question. But if we see you again, I'm going to risk to say that this may be my last chance to persuade you of anything. But if we see you again, I'll try to do better with more time on that answer. Thank you.